This week's episode of the TribCast is supported by former U.S. Ambassador to Mexico Antonio Garza and the Texas Managed Care Alliance. Hello and welcome to the second episode of the TribCast. I'm Eleanor Klibanoff, a reporter here and co-host of the TribCast. I'm joined by my two other co-hosts, politics reporter James Barragan, editor-in-chief Matthew Watkins, and our very special guest, Texas Tribune co-founder, former executive editor, Ross Ramsey.
From the former original TribCast,
Yes.
back in December of 2009.
The Podfather.
The Podfather. Wow. Horrible. We'd like to apologize for that.
I'm leaving.
Reboots never as good as the original, but here we are.
But here we are. We're trying. Thank you all for joining us. It is the first week of session. We're wearing cowboy hats to honor it.
You told me I could take it off.
You can take it off now, Matthew.
Okay.
You're now
There's a fun part of the table over here.
In the afternoon, I'm getting on an airplane, and I just spent this morning trying to figure out how to fit cowboy boots into my very constricted suitcase. Cowboy boots in a tuxedo, and so now maybe
cowboy boots in a tuxedo.
Matthew,
Where
Matthew
are you
is very
going?
important.
Wow.
Matthew is very important.
Into boots and suits up in Washington.
Exactly,
Yeah.
boots and bow ties, or boots and black ties.
Wow. Okay. So that is your Texas credentials. You can take off the hat and still be a proud Texan.
I will admit that I had to borrow the cowboy boots. I have brown cowboy boots, but not black ones. So
Embarrassing.
I didn't.
That is embarrassing. That's
Yeah. So if you're not watching on YouTube, join us on YouTube because we are wearing hats and having a lot of fun.
Some of us are.
Some of us are.
This is a Matthew Watkins roast podcast.
Yes, thank you for joining us. Okay, well, so we are one day into the legislative session. We're recording this on Wednesday morning. We have a lot of news to get through. But before we get to that, James, I was over in the Capitol yesterday. Big first day of school energy. Everybody was finding their locker and seeing their old friends. You were there. What was the energy under the Pink Dome?
Yeah, usually it is first day of school energy, as you said. People are finding their old friends. The new people are very excited. They think they're going to pass all their bills. Their families are there. Everybody's super excited because it's the swearing-in day. But hanging over all of this was the speaker's battle, which I think everybody knew was going to be a big deal and was, frankly, I think people were not really sure which way it was going to go, one way or the other. So that was kind of looming over all of this, and there was this sort of air of uncertainty. You asked everybody, how you doing? How you feeling? They said, well, we'll see. We don't know what's going to happen. So it was a little bit different than other opening days that I've covered.
It was like the first day of school if the student body president and the football captain said they were going to have a fist fight in the cafeteria.
Yeah.
Had been talking about it all summer. So.
Yeah, it was like we all had to elect the class president on day one.
Yeah.
With about as much influence, eventually they would have. So, the brief backstory, if you want the whole backstory on the speaker's race, last week's episode, we got into it in depth. It's also, you can read our coverage on our website. But to summarize, it essentially came down to Republican Dustin Burrows of Lubbock, who was seen as representing the more establishment arm of the party, Representative David Cook of Mansfield, seen as representing this more further right, more insurgent arm of the party. The Democrats also put forward Representative Ana Maria Rodriguez Ramos. It really came down to Cook and Burrows. Last week, James, you and Jasper predicted Burrows would get the vote. I decided to be contrarian and predict that Cook would get the votes. Who was right? What happened?
Well, it ended up being Dustin Burrows, and I think it happened a lot quicker than I expected it to go. It was 2 rounds, and Burrows won with a vote of 85 to 55 with 9 people not voting. But in that first round, the Democrats had a real opportunity, and I'm sure we'll get into this, but Democrats had a real opportunity to, in the second round, make this hurt a little bit more for the Republicans and really squeeze them and make them make a decision rather than cast their lot with the Burrows or Cook team. Ana Maria Rodriguez Ramos, as you said, was in that first round. And because she was in it, and because 23 Democrats stuck with her, neither of the 2 Republican candidates could get to that 76 threshold that would be a simple majority to win the speaker's race. And then there was talk in the chamber of, well, if we can just keep forcing this and keep president not voting or white lighting this, we can force the issue. And there was a question by Mrs. T. Symphonia Thompson of Houston of whether if they just kept going till infinity, could they nominate a new candidate? And the answer was unclear. The answer was sort of, we'd have to ask a parliamentarian. There was no clear answer in the rules. And so I think that really influenced how some of those Democrats voted afterwards, because they were like, do we want to make this keep going and going and going forever, and not have a straight up answer from the parliamentarian? And I think a lot of them decided, well, we don't. Let's just get on board the Burrows team and get this over with. I mean, it still took a lot longer than other speaker votes, but we were done by, I want to say, 2 or 3.
Yeah.
It turns out the Democrats were more united than maybe we thought, right? 43 Democrats for Burrows, 3 Democrats for Cook. 43 Democrats for Burrows, 36 Republicans for Cook. We now have a speaker, again, going back to the days of Joe Strauss, that was elected by more Democrats than Republicans.
Right.
Which makes a lot of people mad.
Well, in the same, something, watching this from outside, a lot of it had in common with the Strauss race. This was less about Republicans and Democrats and more about inside versus outside, and whether the House is going to be controlled by forces outside, whether that's money forces, whether that's the lieutenant governor or the Senate, or they're going to be controlled by the House. And, one way to read this vote is that overcame the partisan differences between the Democrats and the Republicans, and they just voted, look, we want to run our own show. We would rather not have this run from some outside, chair somewhere, and certainly not by the outside chair over on the eastern end of the Capitol.
Yeah, I think that also is, there are also outside influences that impact like the current establishment. We talk about like when you talk about some of the PACs, like obviously ART is very involved, Texans for Lawsuit Reform are very involved in some of those leadership people, and they support a lot of the leadership people. But it's also about, and this is something we talked about last week, but about power. And like the people who are in power and who share that power with the current leadership team. And a lot of the people who are on Cook's team are sort of outside of that power establishment. And obviously they want a new guy in there so they could be part of that power, right? And I think that's going to play out a little bit here, in that they're going to continue to be shut out.
Right. So, how did Burrows get the Democrats? There was conversation about reviving this old thing of having budget chairs on all of the substantive committees so that you could give a CBO chair, I can't remember what it's called, chairman of the budget office or
Right,
something,
yeah.
Anyway, you'd have a budget chair on like the agriculture committee, and you could give that to a Democrat. You're not giving a chair to a Democrat, so you're honoring the Republican Party, but you're giving them a little bit of power. You're putting them on appropriations. Was there anything to that? Was there something substantive the Democrats got out of this?
I don't know if you've heard anything different, Matthew, but I'm not quite sure how they won over the Democrats. I'm sure it is some of those things, and we're sort of actively looking to find out what exactly those not promises, but I guess they're pledges or promises or agreements were. But I think that in the end, the Democrats probably felt that they had a better shot with Burrows than they had with Cook. Overall, in terms of getting their legislation passed, of killing legislation that they didn't see as favorable. But I'm not sure exactly what the details are, and that's one of the big questions for me, like what won them over.
Yeah, I think the big question moving forward is, this has a lot to do with power, as we already talked about, but does it have anything to do with policy and the decisions that are actually going to be made? I think, rightly or wrongly, David Cook was associated with the insurgent wing of the House, a wing that has grown in power and that has been largely associated with a few, the financial support of a few billionaires, and Tim Dunn being the most prominent one. And I think I have to imagine that Democrats, part of this motivation was to just not give that wing a victory, because that wing is what scares Democrats more than anyone else in the state. I think there is a question here of, that wing did not win a victory, technically by electing the speaker. It's still a very conservative speaker. And if you look at the things that wing has been upset about that they haven't gotten in recent years, you're talking about school vouchers, which Burrows supported. You talked about Democrats being allowed to chair some committees in the House. It seems very possible that that's going to go away. You talk about like little, maybe more under the radar things like ending taxpayer-funded lobbying, going after cities and local government's ability to lobby the legislature. Justin Burrows was the author of the Death Star bill that people called it last session, which really, really targeted the power of cities. I think there's a real question about whether that could actually finally make its way through. I mean, a lot of the things that wing has been going for, they might still get what they want, and that wing has been pushing ever since Strauss was elected, probably even before that, putting intense pressure on that wing of the party, and they haven't been able to gain control of the House, but they've been able to push the House in the direction of that they want it to go very, very effectively. And, that now basically the choice for Democrats is essentially two people that want to do the exact same thing, one that's associated with that wing and one that isn't, and they chose the one that isn't.
Right. I mean, the gap between like the Democrats who spoke on behalf of Representative Rodriguez Ramos and like the Texas that they presented, and the gap between what Burrows and Cook supporters presented is vast. Burrows and Cook next to each other look like so similar when you look at compared to, the Democrats were talking about, expanding abortion access, protecting LGBT Texans. Like Burrows, is not talking about any of that. And now to build consensus, he's not going to say, how can I appease the Democrats? He's going to say...
These were cereal boxes. The contents on them were about the same.
Absolutely. Right. I mean, these are the same. It's just that now...
Central Market HEBs.
Right, exactly.
And we won't say which is which. It's not for us to weigh in on.
General Mills,
Yes.
you decide.
Yeah, you decide.
Well, and this is also a mirror image of the Paxton-Strauss fight. There was an effort to knock off Strauss, that was very similar to this. The candidate at the time was a House member named Ken Paxton, and represented by these outside interests, and they were sort of parading around the John Reagan building over here on campus while the Republican caucus met. And the caucus decided to go ahead and go with Strauss. But, this has been a developing fight for a long, long time.
Well, let me just throw this to you, which is like Paxton also loomed large in this fight now that he's Attorney General. I mean, the House impeachment of him, which, he was eventually cleared by the Senate, was a huge part of this insurgent wing gaining power. He also, among others, have sort of threatened this to primary people who oppose. Like, what happens on that front on this question of the caucus fight?
Oh, I think that there's no doubt that there's going to be a lot of primary challenges for sure. The RPT chairman has already said that. Some of the lawmakers, the new, more conservative lawmakers, have already said that. They've said things like "this is war," and they warned beforehand that. That's what Paxton was saying on his 2-day statewide tour. That if they didn't vote, if they didn't honor the GOP caucus endorsed nominee, who was David Cook, that they would be primaried in next year's election. So I think we will see that for sure. But I do want to point out too that I agree with you guys. Like, both of these guys are very conservative, but I do think that there needs to be like new language around what that means, because like they are both conservative. And I think, Matthew, you were saying they're the right wing of the party. I think that is actually the right way to get to it. They're like much more socially conservative. Burrows is more of like the business friendly Republican, but he is also very conservative.
I don't really think it's about a difference of policy. I really think this is, I think you guys were on it when you were talking about power a minute ago. Who gets to run this, and who calls the shots here? And I really do think that the House's chance of sort of calling its own shots internally is stronger with Burrows than it would have been outside with Cook, because Cook, when you analyze that part of that faction, they were getting instructions from somewhere not at the corner of Congress and 12th, but the result for this, if you're looking at this, like we said, if you're looking at this, if I get this speaker, this is the result from the Capitol, and if I get that speaker, this is the result from the Capitol, I'm not sure that's that different.
And I think also, to the point about the primaries too, Burrows did get mostly support from Democrats and a few Republicans. And so that, to a certain extent, I think proves the point of the right-wing conservatives of the party, right? And so that's why there will be, I think both things can be true.
It's also true that in order to get things through the Capitol, you need to agree on the policies and you need to be able to get along, right? And, we all remember last session where there was this massive surplus. Everyone agreed they wanted to spend a big chunk of that money on property taxes. And Patrick and Phelan fought the entire legislative session over how to do that and could not get it done and had to come back for special sessions in order to get that passed. And, I guess maybe they eventually did pass something. So maybe we're just talking about like what's going to happen with our summer vacations.
Like how painful the process is
Right.
of getting there.
Right.
Which, like, do you think it's more indicative of how that's going to go that we came in without a speaker, or that it got resolved pretty quickly? Like, which is more telling?
To me, it's more about how can the House and the Senate get along than how can they get along within the House. I don't really have any doubt in Burrows's ability to get things through the House. It's whether that can then be reconciled with Dan Patrick, who, put out a pretty, salty statement yesterday. He was clearly advocating for Cook in the days ahead of the session. He's not particularly happy. He can hold a grudge. I mean, I think, the question is, will Burrows be able to sort of mend that relationship?
I want to talk about the other chamber, but first let's take a moment to thank our sponsors. Mexico, more than just a neighbor. For timely cross-border insight, turn to former U.S. Ambassador Antonio Garza. Learn more at tonygarza.com. And the Texas Managed Care Alliance, which is working to protect high-quality health care for Medicaid patients, ensure accountability for taxpayer dollars, and advocate for fair and competitive contracting policies. More at texasmanagedcarealliance.org. So we do have an entirely other chamber to worry about. Certainly less sparks on the first day over there, but Governor Greg Abbott was in the Senate. He gave a speech in which he addressed his top priorities of stricter bail laws and school choice, school vouchers, education savings accounts. And Dan Patrick, speaking to Abbott, said, "We passed that school choice bill 5 times. We passed that bail bill 5 times. I don't know who my partner is going to be across the hall, but we passed that bill many times." Obviously, the Senate is not the sticking point for those. But Ross, this school choice, school vouchers issue has been floating around a long time. Is this the session it gets done?
Sure. I think that they
Thanks,
won.
Ross.
They won the primaries. I mean, they basically made a fist and backed it up, and the old school politics. It's like do this or else, and they produced the or else. So everybody who votes against vouchers is in a position where every Republican, I should say, who votes against vouchers is in a position where, unless they have a very, very, very strong signal from home, and or else from home, if you vote for vouchers, we're going to turn you out. They're going to have to follow the governor and the lieutenant governor on this, particularly the governor, because he produced a bunch of money and a bunch of effort that wiped out enough of the House members that it actually was one of the things that called into question the speaker's race. Is the House now controlled by the House like it always has been? It's always been the, sort of the angry younger sibling, right, with its middle fingers up. And there was a moment there where you sort of say, are they going to come into this so cowed that they're going to let the governor and the lieutenant governor determine who the speaker is and what the issues are? But I think that even though they didn't determine who the speaker is, they have determined what the issues are, and you're going to get a voucher bill this time.
Right. I mean, in some ways, it's just how power works. To talk about power is
And
get those people in office.
The other big question may have been solved, by Glenn Hager. There's enough money here to do vouchers and also put a bunch of, sort of leavening money into public schools here, so you can say, we think this is terrible, but also this other thing. So, I think you'll get both of them together.
Yeah, Matthew?
Yeah, I mean, if they don't pass vouchers, in 2025, I'll put this cowboy hat into my regular wardrobe rotation.
Wow.
It's,
A burnt orange cowboy hat for
Put
those
it in your oatmeal.
not watching on YouTube.
Nothing is for sure, of course. Anything can go weird and crazy, but it would just be wild to me if they somehow couldn't get it passed. They have the votes. They have a speaker who supports it. And as we said last week, I think, if I'm Burrows and I need to sort of shore up relationships with the other people in power in this state, one way to really do that is to get that voucher bill through the House very quickly early in the session to make Greg Abbott happy.
Yeah, and I mean, historically, the sticking point there has been rural Republicans who feel like their constituents aren't going to be served by that. Dustin Burrows from Lubbock, he's a supporter. I think there's been more momentum in those rural districts. James, do you feel like those rural Republicans are going to have sway on this issue the way they, or been blockers the way they have been in the past?
Well, a bunch of them, to Ross's point, got replaced.
They're gone.
So they're gone. So they were sort of the buffer, I guess, and they're gone, which leads us to the situation where school vouchers does seem like an inevitability. I think the governor has said he's got 79 hardcore supporters. But the devil's in the details. I think there will be some kind of bill that gets passed. It's just what does it actually look like? But yeah, a lot of those people who were the blockers are either chose to retire or were knocked out in the primaries.
You can ignore the politics for a minute. If you think about school finance, is always sort of turned on. They produce a bill and then they produce these printouts of the 1,200 or 1,100 school districts and say, this is how this piece of legislation will affect financially each one of these districts. So every member of the legislature can look at these and say, I'm okay here, I'm okay, I'm hurt here, all of that kind of stuff. One of the substantive arguments against vouchers has been, you're going to take money out of my public schools and you're going to hurt this community institution, whatever else that means. If they have enough money in a school finance bill that even with vouchers, your district's not hurt, then it takes away some of that argument and it takes away some of the heat that those members might feel from home, and they might be able to hold their nose and vote for it. And then when you add the politics in, as James points out, I don't see how that bill doesn't pass.
And we had a Texas Tribune event up in Dallas. This is not a rural area, obviously, but Morgan Meyer, who supported the voucher bill, he said exactly that. He said, I was looking at the numbers, and it did not hurt my districts. It actually was helping us, was going to bring hundreds of millions of dollars to our districts, and that's why I voted for it. And it becomes easier to rationalize.
Yeah, and what hurt districts was the $4.5 billion that was allocated for schools contingent on vouchers getting passed that didn't go through. I mean, those districts, many of which are very opposed to vouchers, and many people have said, it's not worth it to take that short-term, amount of money. But I wonder how many of them still feel that way after we've seen schools closed and jobs canceled and everything like that. The districts really feel like they need that money.
Right. I mean, this is how power works, right? It's like get who you want in office and hold something valuable hostage until you kind of get what you want.
And some of these may be the things that, as you find out, as we all find out, what, if anything, did the Democrats get in this, brokering this deal? Are we going to base school funding on enrollment instead of attendance? And, all of those kinds of things along the way that, turn a screw here, turn a screw there. It's not like you won the issue, but you won some concessions along the way. Right.
Which I do think Democrats have gotten somewhat savvy at using those small tools, because they're not going to necessarily be able to block these big bills. Speaking of the budget, Matthew, you spoke with Controller Glenn Hagar this week. Give us sort of the rundown of how the money's looking.
The money is looking not as strong as last session, but stronger than pretty much any other session that came before it.
Yeah, it's a small quibble on not as almost.
So going into last session, well, actually, first of all, they have I think $194 billion in general revenue to spend, which is slightly less than they had available in 2023, but more than they actually chose to spend. So they can essentially spend more money than they want to. They have a $24 billion surplus coming in from last year, which again is less than $32.7 billion from last session, but still far more than any other surplus prior to that. Some of that money is the $4.5 billion that I mentioned earlier that didn't go to schools. There's a few other things that kind of are supposed to go to specific accounts like highways and water funds and everything like that hasn't been spent, that's not allocated for. But as Hager kind of confirmed to me on the stage on Monday, they've got about $12 billion to work with that they can kind of allocate to other things. The other thing that I think is really interesting that he flagged in this is that the Rainy Day Fund, the Economic Stabilization Fund, will also reach around $24 billion this calendar year, and will reach essentially its maximum. It's basically the Rainy Day Fund caps out at 10% of prior spending, basically. And for the first time in history, in part because of how much oil and gas are being extracted from the state, which is what funds the Rainy Day Fund, in part because Hager actually won the ability to invest that money and has also been collecting interest and things like that in recent years, it will reach that cap. And one of the questions that Hager was sort of raising is, should the legislature lift that cap and allow that to grow even further? So he's basically saying in a decade that amount could reach $80 billion, or should they, lower taxes with it? They could. It's an oil and gas tax that feeds that. You could conceivably lower that tax, although that only helps a pretty small number of people. Or do you just kind of allow that money, which is the current setup, to go back into the general fund to spend each year? And it's an interesting question. But the big picture thing here is just the state has a lot of money to spend again, and in some ways that'll make things easier. In some ways that'll make it harder for them.
So we're rich this year.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's all good.
Yeah, great.
It's all good. There was back in the day, there was an appropriations chairman, Rob Janelle, later became a federal judge, who said, it's easiest to do a budget in a legislature where the money's short, because people there's a line of supplicants. We want money for this. We want money for that. And you can say, I love you, but we just don't have the money. But when you have a surplus, and he was talking about much smaller surpluses, but when you have enough money, quote unquote, when they come to you and they say, we want this and we want that, you have to say, well, I just don't love you.
Right,
And
right.
It's a different kind of problem.
And everyone starts fighting over what should we use.
So now we've had this line for a couple of sessions now where they've had some kind of surplus, or they've had some kind of, land of plenty. And they've gotten into this mode where they basically, you can see more clearly what their priorities are and are not, because it's not that they don't have the money, it's that they don't have the will for some of these things.
I think three things to look at for likely candidates for some of that money to get spent. One, property taxes. I don't think you can have a surplus in this state, in this political environment, without doing something to lower property taxes. Water infrastructure. That's been a big issue kind of leading up to the session. A lot of people across the political spectrum saying we need to spend more money preparing Texas for the future in terms of water supply and everything like that. And then, as we've already discussed, school funding. The schools really struggling. I think folks would like to sort of take that attack line off the table heading into 2026.
But I think two of those three are, I don't know, we have Ross here, he can weigh in, but wouldn't it be unwise to use like one-time expenditures on them? Like, it seems like the water infrastructure one is the only one that you'd really want to do a one-time
Yeah,
spending.
the water thing is, you can do that with bonding. So you can put one-time money into that and then, sort of live off the corpus to some extent, right? The question is exactly right. The other two are related. If you lower property taxes, you're basically saying the local part of school finance is going to go down, and to compensate for that, the state part's going to go up. That's how you do that. That's a water bid, right? And especially if you're in an environment where you're telling people, we're going to do vouchers, it's not going to hurt schools, everybody's going to go up, right? You have the money to do that and do the property tax thing, but then you have to worry about next time and next time and next time. And that's what's happened to school finance over and over and over again in history, is that it eventually, the state's funding goes down, and that puts pressure on property taxes, and you get back.
Like right now we're rich, and it looks all
Right.
good. But
Right.
when we hit a bust or something, it's not going to be all good. And we may, if there is no legislation that puts in an infrastructure to actually solve these things, or in the budgeting it's solved, then one-time expenditures are kind of hard to justify in the long run, I think.
And if you're an appropriator and you're looking for ways to say no to all those people in line, this is how to do it. Say,
Yeah.
it's one-time money, we can't use it for ongoing expenses.
But those one-time expenditures are popular with, it's
Sure.
Right,
great
it's
to
a great
say,
politics.
I threw
It's great
all that
politics,
money.
sure.
Yeah, right.
It's going to make me
help
feel better
power-
about my property taxes right now.
Right. Yes, exactly. Well, before we go, I think the most important thing on every Texan's mind this week is a thing James and I have been discussing all morning, which
Yes.
is that Dustin Burrows, in addition to being our new House Speaker and representing how power works in the state of Texas, is also the first House Speaker since 1887 to have a beard.
Beards are back.
Beards are back. We've got two beards on this stage. Ross,
I'm not anybody's beard.
Ross, are you thinking about growing a beard now that beards?
I've thought about it all my life. And
Beards
if
are
I had
back.
if I had stopped shaving when I was 13, I would pretty much look like I look right now. Yeah.
Bearded representation on the dais. What does this mean to you guys?
I think Burrows. I think Burrows has got to trim the beard a little bit.
Really?
This is my
You
position.
think
beard
he gets the
hater.
power?
I think
loses
he
the
already
beard.
did. He looked like U.S. Grant.
He certainly trimmed it. He
just
certainly
a-
trimmed it. Yeah. I think when he's out in a Lubbock winter, he's got a bigger one, but he certainly trimmed it.
He had
yesterday.
a hibernation beard for a minute there.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's going to get hot, and Dustin Burrows does then shave it down. But I think I am a strong proponent for the beards. I've been a strong proponent for beards since I started covering the legislature. The last guy, shout out to Asher Price from Axios, because he did all this research. The last guy to have a full-on beard and be the Texas House Speaker was a guy in 1885 called Lafayette Lumpkin Foster. So that is,
Lumpy
breaking
Foster.
barriers.
Yeah, Lumpy Foster. And I hate to be this person, but, not a woman in the bunch in the whole history. But, we do finally have bearded representation. And so, we'll have to see what that means for policy this session.
If you would like to read a story about bearded speakers, please email our editors who are sucking the fun out
They're
of my life
resisting
and
our-
resisting.
Yeah, this is, if anything happens on the beard front, we at the Texas TribCast will be
be
tracking it.
Beard watch.
Yes. We want to thank our sponsors, former U.S. Ambassador to Mexico, Antonio Garza, and the Texas Managed Care Alliance. Our producers are Rob Avila and Chris Svoboda. Oh, Chris, I should have checked your last name before we did this. Chris Svoboda. Our theme music is composed by Rob. I want to thank James, Matthew, and Ross for joining us, and we will see you guys next week.